Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Family Support Technical Assistance Center. Today's webinar is Who is Caring for You? Secondary Trauma and Self-Care with Sue Badeau. I'm Gail Cormier, the Project Director of NASDAC, the Family Center of Excellence. We are led by the National Federation of Families, and I want to thank you all for joining us. This should be a really good presentation, so I'm happy you're here. Before we introduce our speaker today, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording, along with the PowerPoint presentation slides and any additional resources, will be sent via email within 3 to 5 days of all who have registered. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please type your comment into the chat box on the right side of your screen, and someone will be able to help you. Please also type your questions for the presenters in the chat box. And if we have time at the end of the presentation, we'll take as many as we can. We'll be watching the chat during the entire presentation, and you may want to just jot some questions down when we open up for Q&A. You'll remember them that way. The webinar will end 5 minutes before the hour. We ask that you take the time to complete a short feedback survey using the link provided. This survey will help us continuously improve our webinars, and it also fulfills our SAMHSA obligations to provide them with important data requirements by our contract. Please note, all information will be confidential, and we're going to respect your privacy. Please know that we do not offer CEU credits for our webinars, but we will send you a letter of attendance within 3 to 5 days after the presentation. I would like to thank SAMHSA for allowing us to share this information with you today. And again, thank you for joining us. I'll now turn the screen over to our Principal Investigator and Executive Director of the National Federation of Families, Dr. Linda Gargan.
Thank you so much, Gail, and welcome to all of you who are with us today. I want you to just sit back and relax because you are in for a treat. I always enjoy when I have the opportunity to introduce Sue Badeau because she is different than anyone else I know. Sue writes and speaks extensively on topics related to children, particularly those with special needs, and is a frequent keynote speaker and workshop leader at state, regional, and national conferences. Sue and her husband, Hector, are the lifetime parents of 22 children, 2 by birth and 20 who were adopted. Some of her children have mental, physical, intellectual, or emotional challenges. Sue holds a degree in early childhood development and elementary education from Smith College. She has worked in child-serving fields, including adoption, foster care, juvenile justice, children's mental health, and public and private education agencies for 33 years. Sue serves on the national boards of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the North American Council on Adoptable Children, the National Center for Youth in Custody, All Children, All Families, and Justice for Families. You can learn more about Sue and her family by visiting her family's website at www.badeaufamily.com, and we'll put that link in the chat box for you. And now I turn this over to Sue.
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Linda. I always enjoy my opportunities to be here with your team. I'm going to turn my camera on just for a second to say hello to everyone so you can see that I'm really here with you in this presentation. But I'm going to turn it back off as we go through the PowerPoint just because it does make it a little less distracting and better on the bandwidth if we have the videos off while we're running the PowerPoint. So there we go. And I want to turn us to this one here. I don't know about you if this kind of looks like it feels like your life in any way, but it feels like mine many times. And as I was seeing that, it's wonderful that we have such a great turnout, so many of you here. So we won't be able to have you unmuting yourselves and doing a lot of talking, but we do want to make this as interactive as possible. So we will have some poll questions, and we will have the chat box where you can take questions, where you can pose questions. I will respond to them as I can. I will even respond to them going along through, and then some at the end, as Gail had mentioned. Also, there will be times when I'll ask you questions and I'll ask you to respond using the chat box and put in your thought about something. So the polls and the chat box are our two primary ways of being interactive in this time we have together. But I like to start with this particular slide because it reminds me that our lives are just really busy and we're always juggling, and multitasking. And I asked you as you were introducing yourselves to say, you know, what hats or roles you were bringing with you into coming into this webinar today. And I've just seen so many of you posting in the chat, you know, I'm a parent and I'm a caregiver and then you list your various job responsibilities and titles. And so, yeah, I mean, right on this call, right in just that quick little moment where I asked you as you were introducing yourself to tell us about the hats you're wearing, I can see that like me, you are also multitasking and juggling and caring for others and advocating for others. And with all of that, when and how often is there time for yourself? And yet we know that time for ourselves and self-care is essential if we're even going to be able to continue to do all of those other tasks. So that's what we're going to focus on in our time together now. And one of the things I want you to be thinking of as we go through some of these portions in these slides is, you know, to know yourself. How do you respond in times when you are overloaded, when you are stressed out, when you are experiencing a trauma trigger or overexposure to other people's trauma? These ways that are listed here on the slide are some of the ways, are very common ways that people respond in times of difficulty, crisis, stress, or trauma triggers. So perhaps you recognize yourself in some or all of these, and they are definitely not mutually exclusive. I just want to say a word about each of them. The fixer is someone who, when faced with a challenge or a crisis, really wants to solve the problem, be that problem solver, solve the problem, fix it, make it better. The fighter is very related to the fixer. There's a very common link there between fighters and fixers, but the fighter is more the advocacy kind of mode. I'm gonna fight against this problem or this challenge or this change that's happening in the world. I'm gonna, you know, so I might fight it and then fix it, or I might fight it to smooth the way for others who are gonna fix it. But the fixer and fighter are very related to each other. In the past year, that's been a bit challenging because the issues and problems surrounding us have been so huge between the global pandemic and all its different waves and variations and iterations, the increased racial challenges and unrest and reckoning that's happening in our country, economic challenges for many people, other health challenges besides COVID, the mental health crisis really looming because of many of these other issues. Certainly, you know, the turbulence we saw even in our political system and so on, and natural disasters and storms. I mean, we could go on. So it's hard. These problems are so big. They're hard to fix or fight, really, or to know what am I fixing or fighting. Then there's the soother who recognizes, you know what, I am stressed, I'm overloaded, I'm anxious. I need some self-care. I need some soothing, some calming, some comforting. Some of us are better, and this one and the next one, they also go hand in hand, just like the first two did. And what you want to notice about this one and the next one is, where are you on a continuum? Because both of these are continuums. In the soother category, do I recognize when I need help? Do I try? Do I do the self-care? Do I get the soothing? Or do I get really deep into my problems before I even recognize that I might need that soothing? The same thing with the adapter. as with the seeker, I'm sorry. The same thing with the seeker is, am I the kind of person that seeks out resources, supports, and help? Now, all of you who signed up for this webinar have at least a little bit of that inclination in you because you sought out the opportunity to come to this webinar. Again, it's a continuum. We always advise others that seeking help is a really good, important skill or character trait to have, and yet some of us that are in the caregiving realm are not always the best at recognizing when we ourselves need to be seeking help. Now, the adapter is one who kind of similar to the fixer and fighter a little bit, recognizes that there's a problem, but instead of saying I'm going to go out into the outer realm and fix it or fight it, turns inward and says, okay, I'm going to adapt myself. What changes do I have to make internally to adapt to this new, so quote unquote, new normal? And thank you, Gail, for asking people again to add in the box if you see yourself in these. So if you see yourself in several of them, as Kelsey has just noted, yes, this is very common to see yourself at different times in different ones. Now, there are some people who kind of hunker down when there's a storm or a crisis and ride it out, and that is not a bad strategy. Sometimes that can be the smartest and safest thing to do. And then just to go along with this list, I've got a slightly different way to consider the things I've just said. And that is, we're going to look at 4 pictures here of items that can be put in boiling water. So the boiling water can be like the stress or the challenge. And if you take something that's in one example, you have something very fragile. You have eggs that are very fragile and can crack and break easily. You put them in the water, you strengthen them. It turns into that hard-boiled egg. It's not going to just break apart and fall, spill across your floor, right? It's strengthened by the boiling water. You take the potatoes, which are very hard and almost hard as rocks, if you will, before you put them in boiling water. The boiling water softens them. Now you take the rocks and you put them in boiling water. And so as you can see, the boiling water has fundamentally changed the character of both the egg and the potato, made one harder, made one softer. The rocks don't get fundamentally changed by the water. They get changed in the moment. They get heated up. They can even have value in those moments when they're heated up. They can heat your food or your blankets or your, provide heat to an area, a space. And yet then after they're out of the boiling water, they cool right back down again. So they're not fundamentally changed by the experience of going through the boiling. Then we have the coffee beans, which not only get changed themselves by being in the boiling water, but they change the water. They're the ones that actually, by going through the boiling, change the character of the water itself as well as of themselves. So this is another way to sort of think about, well, which one am I? How do I fit in here? Am I, do I get softer or harder as a result of crisis? Do I change the environment around me as a result of my response to the crisis? Or do I kind of warm up to it, address it, deal with it, and then go back to normal? So these are just different ways to think about your own responses in times like this. Now, so what we want to do as we prepare to get into the self-care tips that I'll share is think about why we even need self-care to begin with. And so some of this has to do with our responses to stress, to loss and grief, and then to trauma or trauma triggers. And I'm noticing and loving the comments that are being written in the chat box, so please keep them up so you can all be engaging with one another that way and with me and learning from each other and getting tips and ideas from one another. That's the best part of these kind of webinars, when you get to have some peer-to-peer interaction as well. So we know there's at least 3 kinds of stress: positive, tolerable, and toxic. And positive is not only positive because it represents a good situation or a good experience that might be happening, but positive is also called positive stress because it's necessary. We need it for growth. We need it to thrive. We need it to be motivated. It energizes, it excites, and promotes health and well-being and growth. And if any of you would like to put some examples of things you consider positive stress in the chat box. I would love to see some examples of that. Whereas tolerable stress, we don't actually need to survive or thrive, but it's very normal. It's just a normal, common part of the human experience. And when we go through and it's kind of defined as a natural reaction to a difficult or negative situation. And generally, people can cope with it. That's why it's called tolerable stress, without needing a lot of extra in the way of either self-care or support from others. And then it's when we get into the category of toxic stress. Toxic stress is called that because it overwhelms our capacity to cope using our normal and natural supports that we have available. So that's what moves it out of the tolerable category and into the toxic category. So I haven't seen anyone write any examples of a positive stress. I'd love to get a couple of those before we move on to the next slide. Anyone want to give us some examples of a positive stress you might have experienced?
One thing thinking about positive stress is, for example, if I'm in the supermarket, I'm waiting online. It's stressful, but it's necessary to be online. Everywhere you go, you have to make a line, especially now with COVID. So I think that's positive. Another positive stress, planning for a wedding or expecting a baby.
Yes, very good examples. Absolutely. So when you're doing something like getting food for your family, it's positive, even if it's stressful. Meeting new people, planning a special event like a vacation or a wedding, or buying a home, adding a new family member. Lots and lots of great examples you guys are giving here. Deadlines, anytime there's a deadline or something you sort of had to try out for, whether that's a new job or a team or a play or anything that you sort of have to put yourself out there like that. So that's great to know that we need, and those are valuable, and they actually, doing things that create a little positive stress in our life always can contribute actually to our self-care. So don't avoid the things that cause the positive stress. Tolerable stress, like I said, is what you can get through so that you can cope with it using your natural and normal coping mechanisms and support system. So dealing with the toxic stress is what we're really going to focus on. And sometimes dealing with stress is also something that results from dealing with a loss. And loss being defined here as being deprived of someone or something you value, either because it's leaving you, it's taken from you, often in an unanticipated way. And here's the clincher that really moves it from loss into where we're going next with grief and with trauma, is that it's often seems like it may be, I'm not going to be able to recover from this. This is too much. And a lot of what's been happening in the past year has felt that way. And for some of us with very stressful jobs or life situations with special needs family members, sometimes it seems that way a lot, even before the pandemic came. Now, this is when we start to move into grief. And before I go to the next slide, I am going to post a poll question. Now, you should be able to see it now on your screen and respond to it, but I also will read it out loud in case anyone can't see it. You can, if you can't respond on the screen, you can write your response in the chat box. I'll read it aloud. And I'm only going to give about 30 seconds each time we do a poll. So I do encourage you to really get your answers in there as quickly as possible. This one says, grief is a process with recognizable stages, which either A, proceed in a linear fashion, B, are not linear and can be experienced differently by different people, C, only occur after death, other losses are not experienced as grief, or D, generally lasts about a year. So just a few more seconds. We've gotten about 2/3 of you have replied, and I'll leave it up a few more seconds to get a few more of you in there, and then I'll close it out. Oh, and by the way, when you do the chat, when you do the polls, no one can see who responded with what answer. We just see an aggregate response of all the answers when I share that. All right. We didn't quite, we just got about 3/4 of you, but I am going to end it now in the interest of time and share the results. And it wasn't unanimous. You all know that the process of grief is not linear and is experienced differently by different people. Great. So that's important to remember as we then look at the stages of grief, which have been initially identified by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. And they talk about these stages. And I just want to acknowledge that we have some comments in the chat box where people are opening up and sharing some of the things that create those senses of trauma, loss, and grief. So thank you for your honesty and vulnerability there. As we think about these stages of grief, I just want to share with you an example from David Kessler, who is one of the people who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on this, shares how this sort of was experienced by people just during the pandemic itself. So he said, with this virus, it can be confusing for people. Our primitive mind knows something bad is happening, but we can't see it. This breaks down our sense of safety, and we are feeling this loss of safety. It's been a long time, if ever, since we've all collectively lost our general sense of safety like we have in the past year. Individually or as smaller groups, people have felt this, but all together, it's new. We're grieving on a micro and macro level. So understanding the stages of grief is a good way to help us begin to respond to this, he goes on to say. Whenever I talk about the stages of grief, he says, I have to remind people that the stages are not linear, as we just noted in our poll, and may not happen in this order. It's not a map, but it provides scaffolding. I like that image for this unknown world. So let's look at how he defines how it sort of occurred during the pandemic. First, there was denial. You know, this is a virus that's somewhere else. It's over there. It's not going to affect me. Then there's anger and possibly guilt and shame along with it. You know, I don't want to have to stay home. I don't like wearing masks. I don't want to not be able to see people I care about. Or, oh, maybe when I didn't wear a mask and then I found out someone got sick, maybe it was my fault. I feel guilt. So those things kind of came in. And then there's these sort of bargaining. Okay, I understand. I get it. I have to wear this mask, wash my hands, quarantine for a week or two. But then it's all going to be fine, right? Until the sadness and the sort of, for some, despair set in to realize, you know what, it's not going to all be fine. I'm doing my part. I'm doing what I was supposed to do, but it's taking longer. We're not getting to any kind of new normal. So then that's where we get to hopefully some sense of acceptance. You know, okay, there's things I can do. I can learn. I can do this. I can make this work. And then we get a little bit towards the idea of making meaning from it, which I'm going to show you a slide in a couple of minutes about post-traumatic growth. And that ties in with this last bullet here of making meaning. So there are many different types of grief, and they follow patterns similar to that basic outline we just looked at. And as we think about the self-care that I'll be suggesting related to this webinar, I just wanted to highlight 4 of the types of grief. The first one was what you might conclude normal, and I put it in quotes because we are all different. It's different for so many people. And then I'm going to mention ambiguous grief, and I'm going to just do a poll about that to see how familiar you are with that term. So the poll says ambiguous grief occurs when A, you're not sure why you're grieving, or B, there's nothing to grieve about, but you're down or depressed, or C, the stages of grief are just not progressing, or D, you're experiencing a loss not acknowledged by others. Okay, and we've gotten just a little over half of you have replied. I'll leave it up for a few seconds. So I'm just see we've got about 2/3 of you replied. Just a couple more seconds, and then I'll close it down. Okay, and this one, and look at the results. And so it's perhaps a term not as many are familiar with. About 20% of you said the last answer, you're experiencing a loss not acknowledged by others, which actually is the definition. So just wanted to check that out. So ambiguous loss is when there's a loss not acknowledged by others. So for example, in the world outside of the current pandemic situation, Sometimes it happens when someone has something like a miscarriage and they're grieving from that, whereas others never even knew that they were pregnant, or even those who did kind of don't understand it or say, oh, well, you can try again, or, you're young or something like that, and don't really acknowledge the depth of the loss. There's plenty of these kinds of examples within the mental health world, within the child welfare, juvenile justice. Lots of times when people experience losses that are not really acknowledged by others. But in the past year, we've been having a lot of that as well. When we recognize that some people are dying from this pandemic, some people are losing their businesses or their jobs or their security of their housing. And so others maybe feel a little less comfortable sharing the losses they're experiencing, maybe those high school seniors that aren't able to have their full graduation or prom. And people are doing some comparison, and that's never helpful. Comparison does not help with our self-care or overcoming loss or grief. Anticipatory grief is when we're sort of waiting for that next shoe to fall, something that hasn't happened yet, but we just know it's on the horizon. And then collective grief, kind of what we're all going through, as I've mentioned. But yet, when we don't all go through it equitably, there's racial inequities. There's other kinds of inequities that you'll see in a minute or two on the slides that mean even though we're all going through something, we're not all going through it in the same way. So then we get into the definition, as I mentioned, of toxic stress is when the stress reaches a level that overwhelms our capacity to cope, and that takes us into the world of trauma and all of these other terms that have been used over time to describe trauma. And the two that are just initials there, I'll say them out. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSS is post-traumatic slave syndrome. These are just examples of ways that we've learned to understand trauma. And we know that trauma can be experienced by individual children or adults, as well as whole families and communities, as well as across generations. And that each time trauma hits, it's like a storm. So I've used these storm images to sort of remind us of what trauma is and how it hits us. Acute trauma being a one-time thing, chronic trauma being when you have again and again and again. Complex trauma, when someone who's supposed to care for you and look out for you actually ends up being the one who harms you. So that can be when a parent abuses a child. It can also be, though, when there's a teacher or a therapist or a social worker or a coach or a priest or a pastor or someone in law enforcement, anyone who's in a position where your job is to look out for and care for and protect others. If you're the one that harms them, then that becomes a complex trauma. We have race-based trauma and historic multi-generational trauma are related. They're living with the impact of things that have occurred over generations, not just in the present moment. And then I'm sure you're all familiar with the term secondary trauma, but let's just do this poll real quick. Secondary trauma is what? A, less severe than primary trauma? Is it not something children experience? Does it result from continuous or frequent exposure to other people's trauma? Or is it what happens when you have a memory of a past trauma? Okay, and I'm going to close this one down now. And a good number of you, 84% of those who responded, recognize that secondary trauma does result from continuous or frequent exposure to other people's trauma. The other answer that some of you selected happens when you have a memory of a past trauma. That's more of what we refer to as a trauma trigger, and they can be related, but they're not exactly the same. So secondary trauma is this frequent or continuous exposure to other people's trauma, and it's that frequent and continuous nature of it that can feel like a bombardment that really leads to secondary traumatic stress, and where is really where we need the big focus on self-care. And as one of my friends who teaches on this topic likes to put it, it's not the one you can't forget, it's the 100 you can't even remember. All those day-to-day little micro traumas, microaggressions wear us down even more than the big ones. Now, you may have heard this described in multiple terms. You see on the left there the terms that describe the challenges we face when we deal with these issues. And there's burnout and vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue are all different ways people describe what I'm also calling secondary trauma here. But the beauty is that we also have the opportunity to develop strengths, increase our empathy, compassion, satisfaction, develop resilience, and even experience resilience vicariously through our work as a helper or caregiver with others. And then post-traumatic growth. I'm going to show you some definitions of those terms in a moment. And I see the question about secondary trauma being common. I'm going to get to an answer on that in just a couple seconds. First, I want to note that all of these different kinds of stress and anxiety and grief and loss and trauma, they affect our whole being, our thoughts, our feelings in our body, as well as our feelings in our emotions, and then, of course, in how we react and act. So that would be our behavior. And when we are actually experiencing a trauma or a trauma trigger, trauma reminder, trauma trigger, there are many ways that this has been described in terms of survival brain. You may be most familiar with the terms fight or flight. Perhaps freeze is one you're pretty familiar with. You may be less familiar with these others, but they're also survival sensations that our brain goes into at times when we are facing a trauma, a loss, a lot of stress, or anxiety. So flock is that need to be with others, our people, our kind, to just be with people that you love or that you care about or that love you and care about you when there's lots of stress or crisis going on. Flap or frenzy is when our brain is kind of stuck between we're not going yet into flight, we're not going yet into fight. We just got this hyper arousal, hyper alertness. We've got this flow of a lot of adrenaline and other cortisol and everything, but it's not focused. It's unfocused energy. Maybe you've noticed some of that in yourself in recent times. And then fawn is when the brain says, the best way to survive this is just to not have an opinion, not to have a voice, not to fight, not to flee, not to freeze, not to do anything but give in and please others. And then, of course, there's fatigue. And this is what each of these looks like as an example in terms of behavior. These are not, this is not a be-all, end-all list. This is just to show you that each of these trauma responses that are the survival responses in our brain can be associated with different types of behaviors that we might see in ourselves or in others. And these can give us a clue when we need to pay a little more attention to our self-care needs. Now, secondary traumatic stress symptoms tend to come in 3 clusters, those that are known as intrusive, avoidance, and hyperarousal. So the intrusive ones are when you get thoughts, dreams, reliving of someone else's trauma or challenge or your own. There was one person who works as an administrative assistant for caseworkers, and she was quoted as saying, all I do is type the reports for the caseworkers, but I have dreams about what I've typed. It's intruding. The stories of the harm being done to children or whatever is intruding on her thoughts and even her dreams. Avoidance, pretty obvious when we avoid certain places, people, situations. Maybe we have a sense of foreboding about going to a particular event. Numbness often and detachment come with this avoidance one. And then hyperarousal is literally when we're constantly on alert. We're irritated often, we're suspicious, we have trouble concentrating, we startle easily. It often affects our capacity for getting good sleep. And there's an excellent book called Trauma Stewardship by Laura Vandermoot that is does a great job describing this in even more detail. So also to be aware that this secondary traumatic stress affects us across all of our, you know, who we are, our cognitive self, our emotions, our behavior, our spiritual, our interpersonal capacity to relate to others, as well as our physical health and well-being. And it affects us in our job as well. So it affects professional functioning by, you know, anything related to performing our tasks. anything related to performing tasks, relationships with others at work, other kind of work-related situations, but also morale can be significantly affected. And then also how we apply knowledge and our capacity to think and prioritize, to be able to prioritize and make decisions and recognize the difference between a true safety or emergency issue versus something that's not. Because when we're in this constant state of hyperarousal, we often see everything as an emergency, everything as a crisis, and we're kind of operating out of crisis mode all the time, and that wears us down and it's not healthy. And so here's where I also wanted to make a mention of and answer the question that was asked earlier about, we know that secondary traumatic stress is particularly, we're particularly vulnerable if you're in the helping fields, helping professions, social work, mental health in particular, and especially if you work with the most vulnerable. So children with disabilities, children with mental health challenges, families with children with special needs. When you work in those fields, the evidence is that you are at a much higher likelihood, as well as when you're the caregiver and family member living in those families, you're at a much higher likelihood of secondary traumatic stress than people who work in other fields. Now, you're going to see that I'm going to talk about being aware and developing awareness and doing some of your own self-assessment. So I wanted to let you know that I did share on this slide here 3 types of self-awareness tests that you can take, all of which have been tested and tried and validated on various populations. And in particular, I wanted to highlight that the ProQoL has been validated the most. It's not for it's not to determine, it's not a health screening, it's not a mental health screening. It really is just an assessment to help you know, where am I right now and where are some areas that I might want to improve on in my own self-care. So it's a good starting point to start with these self-help or self-assessment, I should say, guides, and then you can develop your self-care plan in a more targeted, strategic way. So I told you I would give you the definitions of 2 final terms. One is resilience and the other is post-traumatic growth. So this is what we're going for. So every bit of the self-care tips I'm about to share in the remaining time are evidence-based, that they actually help lead towards post-traumatic growth, which is this positive transformation as described here, and resilience, this capacity to thrive and mature, and increase in your competence even in the face of adversity, which is why I like using the photos that I use on these slides of flowers, surviving through growing in the concrete. We even have a quote from Tupac Shakur here about that very thing that to me defines resilience even better than the so-called scientific definitions. The rose that grew from the crack in the concrete. So we're going to use our final remaining time to look at what I call the ABCs of self-care if you're experiencing secondary trauma or other challenges related to that. So the ABCs I'm going to highlight here in these next several minutes are awareness, balance, and connection. So we're going to we've talked some about awareness. Awareness was really what I was talking about when I highlighted the doing the self-assessments tools that I just shared with you a minute ago. Awareness was recognizing the symptoms you have, whether you're the fixer or the adapter. So all of the pieces that I've shared so far, understanding definitions, really everything I've shared so far is related to that question of awareness. And then we move on to balance, and we want to seek balance in our life by really being able to recognize those rough feelings, recognize those traumas, those griefs, those losses, those anxieties, give ourselves and others grace and space to recognize and express those feelings. We don't want to squash them. We don't want to deny them. We want to allow them to have expression, because if we don't, and this is an important quote to remember, stress will accumulate and anxiety will incubate if we don't give them voice. But then we want to pull ourselves back into balance so that we don't stay lingering in that negative space. So I'm going to be sharing with you a set of daily questions for reflection, and they help us with both the awareness, but also the developing of balance, the developing of the balance that we need. So those daily questions, which you will get when you get the handouts, as was just reminded in the chat about that, you will get all of this. Use these questions and actually, write down, reflect on your responses to them. Whoops, before we do that, I have a poll I wanted to share. Write down your responses to these questions, as it will help you to get that balance that you need. So I'm going to launch this poll. Saying aloud or writing down difficult or negative feelings, which answer do you think is best? Should be discouraged because it leads to more negative thinking. Is healthy because it helps you not to get stuck in the negative space. Should only be done when you're not around children so you don't expose them to negative thoughts. Or is only safe when done in a therapist's office. Okay, great. We've gotten about 2/3 of you in, and I am going to wrap up this poll. Share the results. So great. You're tracking with me now. It's definitely healthy because it helps you not to get stuck in the negative space. Even children need to see that it's okay to express in healthy ways, have healthy self-expression, even of our most negative emotions. We need to be able to model and demonstrate this for them. Sometimes some of this we want to do with a therapist, but it's perfectly okay to take your own time to say, express these feelings, as long as you then pull yourself back in balance. And that's what the questions ahead are going to help you to do. So we will close out that poll. So the first 3 questions I want to highlight are morning questions for reflection. So in the morning, starting your day by asking yourself, what is one goal? And you'll notice each of these questions I'm providing have the number 1 in them. Because the idea here is that focus. If you focus your brain, focus your thoughts, focus your energy on one thing at a time, that's a big part of your self-care. So these questions that I'm now going to be sharing, starting with this slide, and we have several to share that are to take you throughout the day. As I mentioned before, they have an evidence base that they help you build resilience and post-traumatic growth. This is a self-care plan. It doesn't cost money. It doesn't take a lot of time. You ask yourself these reflective questions throughout the day, and then you do the activity that they might suggest. You'll see a few of them suggest an activity. And if you ask these questions, if you take the time to reflect and you do the activity that they suggest, that's how you build self-care into your day without having to add a dime of cost or really very little in the way of time. Now, you can still do other self-care things like a stay at the spa or a vacation trip, or now that things are opening up, maybe out somewhere for coffee or dinner. There's things you can do that are bigger chunks of self-care, but I want you, for this purpose, to focus on these little small things you can do throughout the day, because this is where the research and the evidence shows you get the most bang for your buck, as it were. You really will get that resilience and that post-traumatic growth if you do this daily focus on self-care. So you begin by asking, what is one goal I have for the day? Not my whole to-do list, but one goal. Who is one person I can turn to for support? Who is one person I will reach out to and connect with? And I am going to ask a poll question that kind of goes along with this. These questions. Why do I have that last one? Why do I want you to reach out to someone else, offer help to someone else? How am I saying that that's part of self-care? What do you think? Reaching out to others during a time of stress should be handled by trained professionals. Is not a good idea if you aren't equipped to solve their problem. Can be helpful for both people. Connection is essential to coping and healing, or can only be accomplished by in-person contact. Okay, and once again, I see we've gotten about 2/3 of you, so I'm going to close it out. And we've got a unanimous consent on this one. It's helpful for both people. Yes, there's research that when you reach out and help someone else, it not only can benefit that other person, but it also benefits you. So this is in the morning before you even start your day. Just pose these 3 questions to yourself. And remember, we're hardwired to connect with others. I love this quote from Brene Brown. So I'm going to give you one more poll question related to this topic. This is a simple true or false one. The most important strategy in your self-care toolkit is to connect with someone every day. True or false? Okay, we've gotten a little over 2/3 of you, so I'll close it out. Share the results. And while it wasn't completely unanimous this time, it was close. You mostly all do understand that that's true. Absolutely all the research will tell us that connection, as Brene Brown words it here in this quote, gives purpose and meaning and is the single most important thing you can do for self-care. But there are some other things, so let's move on to the next part of the day when I invite you to ask reflective questions. And the 3 questions I invite you to consider as you get to your lunchtime of your day are, what's one way I'll nourish and move my body today? You know, don't beat yourself up if you didn't stick to your fitness plan or you ate something you know, have been trying to avoid. Don't beat yourself up for that. But take that moment to reflect and say, what's one thing I can do right now today to nourish and move my body? And what's one way that I'll nourish my spirit? And one way that I will nourish my mind? Now, you might wonder, why is this so important, especially the part about our body? So I'm going to ask you a poll question about that. It is important to move your body during periods of stress, grief, or trauma because A, trauma and grief are stored in your body and movement helps with coping and healing. You might gain weight from stress eating and being less active than usual. If you're exposed to the COVID-19 virus, you can sweat it out so you won't get sick, or none of the above. Okay, I'm going to end this one. And we got close to unanimous that yes, the absolute reason I was looking for, trauma and grief are absolutely stored in your body, and movement helps with coping, health, well-being, and healing. So every day you want to at least do one thing. One of the fun things you can do is these days is turn on music or even on YouTube and look for 1-minute dance parties. You can just dance for a minute. You can take a walk. You can you know, do some stretching or some desk yoga. There's lots of things that we can do that, again, don't take a lot of time, don't require a gym membership, but that get our mind and our body and our spirit nourished. And then the next thing we want to focus on, and I call this the tea time question, to take some time in that mid-afternoon time of day when some people might have tea. But even if you're not a tea drinker, just take a little break mid-afternoon and ask yourself this question. What is one thing of beauty that I've seen or heard or created today? And use all of your senses as you imagine that. You know, again, it says seen or heard, but also smelled or tasted or touched. What is one thing that I have experienced, and then can I share it with someone else? Because it's in both the noticing and the sharing that you get the benefit for the self-care purpose. And getting outside in particular, getting grounded outside, touching the earth, recognizing that the earth is strong enough to hold me up, is a great strategy for that sort of seeing, feeling, touching, hearing, being in touch with your senses, being grounded, being mindful, and noticing beauty. So taking even just a few minutes each day to do that. Now we're getting towards both the end of our time together, but also the end of our day in terms of the reflective questions. So I just encourage you to ask now, as we get towards that time of day we call dinner time. These 3 questions are good questions to ask among others. So that's why I call them the dinner time questions. to have a sharing and conversation. It increases that sense of connection, but it also, again, builds that sense of resilience. Can I identify one thing I learned today? Something I experienced success in today. It could be related to that one goal that I set at the beginning of the morning, or it could be, you know, something that surprised me. And then one thing that made me laugh or smile today. And then finally, I want to encourage us that we want to end the day well so that we're ready to start the next day anew. And so with that in mind, I'm going to give you the last final 3 questions, which are the what I call the bedtime questions. And literally just before you get in bed, to ask yourself, is there one worry I can let go of while I sleep? Now, here's a little trick or tip for that. Write it down. Write your worry down, your concern, what you're stressed about. Write it down, and then take that piece of paper that you wrote it on and put it in a different room, not the room you sleep in. So you are telling your mind, you're saying, I know I'm still going to have to deal with that tomorrow. I'm not going to tear it up, throw it in the trash, burn it, because I know that that means that I'm just fooling myself, because I am going to still have to deal with this tomorrow. But rather, I'm setting it aside in a different room to tell myself this worry, this concern is not going to invade my sleep. I can let go of it while I sleep, because getting good sleep is an important part of self-care. And then the last 2 questions, and there's a ton of research about these, believe it or not, that these are questions that when you ask them and focus and reflect on these things, it actually does, again, build that resilience and that growth that we're looking for. Something I'm grateful for, being intentional about being grateful, and something I'm looking forward to, which really gives us that sense of having hope and optimism. And next to connection, okay, I said the single most important thing was connection. Next to that, hope and optimism. So as we wrap up, and as I turn it back over to Gail for the closing and any questions, I just wanted to leave you with these 3 sort of final self-care points. Hold space for and acknowledge hard feelings. Simplify, but don't neglect your self-care plan. And connect with someone every day. And on that note, I am going to turn it back to Gail to wrap us up or share any questions that she needs me to respond to. Thank you all for your great participation in the chat box and on the polls. And Gail, I hand it over to you.
Sue, this was just fabulous. And I know as a constant worrier, I'm going to be using some of these tools. So as we said at the beginning of the presentation, we'd love to take this time to answer some questions you may have. If you could write those questions in the chat box, that would be great, and we can answer them. While we're waiting, we did have a question while you were speaking, and it asked, can you explain more about the compassion fatigue scale?
So the compassion fatigue scale is a self-assessment tool, and it just helps you to learn the signs. Again, it's part of the awareness, the A of the ABC part. It's part of the awareness. It helps you learn to recognize your own signs of if your effort to be compassionate, to be caring, to be a caregiver in your personal or professional life, is it wearing you down? Is it putting you near the line, the borderline, where you're getting and straying into that toxic stress category, and you need to sort of reflect on that and identify ways that you can do some self-care. So it is a self-assessment tool. It helps you to have some awareness for yourself so that you can then always implement some self-care strategies to help mitigate that.
Well, thank you, Sue. Are there any other questions today?